I'd like to welcome Robert Rickover to the podcast and the summit right now. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
So, Robert is the creator of the Alexander Technique website, and you are the admin. You monitor different Facebook groups, and you're also a certified practitioner. So, I'm very much looking forward to talking with you, learning about the Alexander Technique. I've heard a lot about it. I know it's been around for many years. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. I know a lot of people are trying to control pain. They're trying to recover from injuries. So how could the Alexander Technique help people? What is this approach, and how could it benefit people?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing that's important to say about the technique is it's not a therapy. It's a teaching method. We teach people basically how they can use their bodies more efficiently in whatever they do. And with and if they do use their bodies more efficiently, there's much less chance of injury or pain. And if they're performers, which is a large part of our client base, I would say, musicians, actors, dancers, and so on, they will be able to improve the quality of their performance, which is, of course, very, very critical in those kind of competitive fields. So, but to answer your question about pain, you want to go to that right now?
Yeah, well, we'll wait on it just for a second, because
Okay.
what you mentioned was important, and I liked your distinction between separating it from therapy,
Yeah,
because especially
we're very big on that in the Alexander world. Now, there are some Alexander teachers who have qualifications in other fields, particularly physical therapy is the most common, and some teachers have qualifications in things like psychotherapy and the like, and sometimes they might combine the two or incorporate one with the other. I'm just a straight up Alexander teacher. I don't do anything else. But yeah.
yeah, so the understanding of physical therapy, at least here in the United States, is that it's mainly it's for the diagnosis and treatment of musculoskeletal injuries, and there could also be other issues too,
Mm-hmm.
neuromuscular injuries
Absolutely.
like
Yeah.
stroke and spinal cord, and a wide range. And so it could be used to treat injuries, but it could also be used for some preventative and proactive treatment as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so the goal of the Alexander Technique, is it different than helping somebody rehab from an injury, or what is the main goal of the technique?
Well, if to give an example, supposing you have a serious injury that's causing you a lot of pain, like whiplash injury, for example, um, you probably do well to go to a PT or a chiropractor or someone who can help you in the short term just get through that situation. Um, but longer term, there may be more subtle things that your body has done because of that injury that are kind of behind the scenes a little bit. And the Alexander technique would be a great way to get at those, so that not only is the immediate pain taken care of, but longer term, you're less likely to have some sort of recur, have it happen again. More likely, or more typically, would be people who have suddenly developed backache or neck pain, shoulder pain, often that seems to come out of nowhere. And again, it may be, if it's acute enough, that going to a medical practitioner is the way to go initially. But what this work can help with is help you learn how to use your physical mechanism more efficiently, uh, and make it less likely that you would have a recurrence of that injury. That it could be that that pain is caused by perhaps excess pressure on some part of your spinal cord, for example, spinal column, and that could in turn be due to you simply not using yourself well, putting extra strain where it doesn't really belong. And typically that's a pretty unconscious process. So people need to start, first of all, becoming aware of what's going on in their body. And then we teach very specific skills in bringing about useful change.
I like the two scenarios that you mentioned. One was a car accident. If
Yeah,
somebody has a car accident, oftentimes it might even be there might be some legal implications with that. So they might
sure.
be going through a certain legal case and have their insurance provide a certain number of visits to get better and to rehab. And as a physical therapist, I've worked with people in that situation where you're dealing with insurance and you might get up to a certain number of visits and then you're done. And the person might be 90% better, maybe not even quite at 90%. There's going to be a range with that. And a car accident takes a long time to heal. So afterwards, when they're done with physical therapy, they could still have these ongoing residual effects. And that's where it seems like something like the Alexander technique can be very effective, because it sounds like it's very, it's like teaching somebody how to incorporate this into their day-to-day life, how to actually know their body inside and out.
To have the kind of knowledge that's going to be useful for them. We're not going to be teaching people detailed anatomy or anything like that. But there are some basic facts about how we function that most people, and they're not complicated. A lot of them are really simple. In fact, many of them could be taught to a 5 or 6 year old kid, and probably should be taught to 5 or 6 year old kids, but that's not how it happens these days. But they're sort of basic pieces of information about our structure and how it works that can be extremely helpful to people. And for the most part, most people just are not aware of them. And that's on a more physical level. On a more mental level, there are ways that you can intervene using your brain, your mind, say, to bring about changes. And that's, I'd say, the more, ultimately the more powerful, but at the same time more subtle aspect of the technique. When we teach people how to change the way they think about movement, and that can make a gigantic difference in how they function. And of course, that in turn can make a big difference in things like pain or performance ability, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really good. And I want to go a little bit more into those two things that you mentioned, into the physical aspects of it and then also the mental. And because the other scenario that I was saying that this could be good for is the people who have aches and pains, and they may not have some specific diagnosis. There may not be just one single thing that's wrong,
Mm-hmm.
in which they would go to their doctor and then get a written diagnosis. That could be very frustrating to a lot of people, because they end up leaving the doctor's office with something that's very vague. They've gotten imaging like an X-ray or MRI. Everything looks normal, but then they don't feel normal. So
Yeah.
the physical side of it, what are some of the physical manifestations of pain? Maybe not manifestation, but what are some of the underlying reasons why somebody's having musculoskeletal pain?
Well, before I do that, I just want to clarify one thing. Alexander, the guy who developed this work, his name was F. Matthias Alexander. He was an Australian, and it was developed about 120 years ago, roughly. It is constantly evolving, so it's hard to pinpoint a specific date. But he came to the conclusion that body and mind were basically just two aspects of the same thing. He even used the fancy term of psychophysical unity to indicate that everything you do contains both physical and has both a physical and a mental component. So, for example, if you're lifting weights or doing something that's very, very physical, what you're doing is mostly physical, but certainly your mind's at work as well. And secondly, that it's impossible to have any thought of any kind without there being some physical correlate. Now, it might be incredibly tiny and hard to measure, but thoughts bring about actions, and actions involve thoughts. And so we're not too big on separating them. Alexander himself said in his books, he would say things like, I'm going to use the word body and the word mind, but I want the reader to understand that I'm really just talking about things that are relatively more physical and relatively more mental. So I took a little sidetrack there, and I kind of lost track of the question that prompted that. So
that was good. That's a good. It helps me understand the technique better because I'm not familiar with it. So it's
yeah,
you're combining both the mental aspects of physical and
yeah.
just lifestyle
Let
and
me,
the
yeah,
mental aspects of it. To make
absolutely. Let me give you an example that I think might. It's one of many possible examples, but it's one that's pretty interesting for most people who spend a lot of time sitting at a computer or sitting at a desk. Often, if they come for lessons, either online or in person, one of the first things the teacher is going to check on is how is their body being supported by whatever surface they're sitting on. And I'm sure you know the term sits bones. That's the kind of the colloquial term for it, the little protrusions downward from your pelvis. They're like little rockers, and they are perfectly designed to take our weight when we're sitting. They're incredibly strong, and they can take our weight and the weight of several people on top of us with no problem. Many people do not actually sit on their sits bones. Some of them sit on their sacrum, which is probably one of the worst things you can do. And so we might spend some time just getting people familiar with the location of those two bones. And if they're sitting on a firm surface, they're not going to have too much trouble feeling them. And they can feel what happens when they rock back and forth like this or sideways. Become familiar with that support, what I'd call it, not mechanism so much as the part of them that is designed to receive the support of the seating surface. And of course, that also can veer into a little discussion of what constitutes a good chair. And I think most Alexander teachers would say a good chair is a hard chair, or pretty solid surface, not a cushion or that sort of thing. And we would probably also say it's going to be helpful if your hips are a little higher than your knees. So a stool might be better than a chair, that kind of thing. That's the more mechanical, physical side of things. And sometimes that may be the most useful first thing to talk about for someone. But then the question comes, okay, I've located my sits bones, I'm sitting with them, and I notice that I'm sitting a little more easily, but there may be some patterns I have, say, around my head and my neck, like oh, there's a screen and I'm so interested and I'm so interested and I'm pushing my head forward, my head and my neck forward, and I'm compressing here. And it could be a very subtle version of that, or it could be a very dramatic version of that. And there's where some mental directions can come into play. Some very simple self-directions that you can use on yourself that'll move you out of that dysfunctional compressive pattern. So there's where mental self-directions come into play.
Going back to the sit bones.
Sit bones. Yeah.
Sit bones. Yeah, it's a powerful visual to imagine your sit bones. Imagine your ischial tuberosity, right? And you can feel them if you put your hands on your butt, basically.
I get my students to put their hands underneath their butt and feel them if they have no idea where they are. And then if they're sitting on a firm surface, they usually can feel them pretty quickly without having their hands there.
And if you Google ischial tuberosity and you look at the shape of that bone, it's like a U. It's curved.
It's a rocker. It's a rocker, just like a rocking chair.
Exactly. And you can imagine yourself just rocking right on that bone and shifting your weight back and forth. And if you slouch too much, then you're going to put weight right onto the tailbone, right onto the sacrum and the coccyx.
A lot of people are sitting with the weight on their sacrum, and that is, as I'm sure you know, like the sacrum is the last part of you that you want to be weight bearing, whereas the sits bones are literally just sitting there waiting to bear all the weight you got and more. Yeah.
And then, like you said, that's the physical part of it, and then you have then you have to bring your awareness to it, because if you're not even thinking about it, then you don't know what you're doing. And then if you're stressed or you're distracted, you might be doing some position with your body just out of that habit. You might be slouching because you just feel comfortable to have that pull and that tension on your back. You might be in a nervous situation. You might cross your arms like this, holding your shoulders in. Maybe I'm talking to you and I have my shoulders like this because I just have some tension instead of being relaxed and keeping them down. And that there's no physical reason why I'm doing that. It's coming from a state of stress and anxiety.
It's a habit. And habits can be very deep, and they can have lasted for many years of your life. Some of them people pick up when they're very young by imitating the people around them. Small children are incredible imitators. And you can often see in a family, you can see patterns from one or both of the parents that manifest in their children. And actually, Mr. Alexander, the guy, made a very interesting observation about that phenomenon. He said it's not just that kids imitate the people around them. They especially imitate anything that's weird and out of the ordinary. They're attuned to looking for things that are off the scale a little bit, either in a very good direction or in a very bad direction. So let's say Fred Astaire had a child. The child's going to have an amazing person to imitate. And because Fred Astaire, if you see his movies, he exemplifies everything that this work's about. He never had Alexander lessons, but he's someone who just never lost his innate ability to move easily and gracefully. So if he had a kid and the kid was using him as an example, that'd be phenomenal for the kid. But if someone is walking around like this all the time or hunched over, a parent, one or both parents, the kid's going to go for that. That's going to be, oh, that's how you stand,
That's a very interesting way to look at it, because if you're not motivated to improve your posture, if you're not motivated to do something healthy for yourself, maybe you could think about it by trying to instill better movement habits for your children, because those critical years of 0 to 7 years old, they're subconscious programs are getting written, and whatever programs they're going to create at that age, they're going
Yeah.
to take with them for their whole life. And then if they need to change it, they're going to have to relearn it, and it's going to be very challenging for them.
Alexander says in one of his books or something he wrote that really the work that we teachers do should be with children. It shouldn't be with adults, because in an ideal world, because with children, a teacher could work with a child for just a very short time and make dramatic improvements in that child's functioning. By the time our students come to us, they're in their 40s and 50s, and they have, multiple long, deep-rooted patterns of distortion in themselves, and it's a bigger deal to change that. It's not a huge deal, but it's a inherently less efficient process working with adults. And Alexander, he had a little school he set up in England that was just based on Alexander principles, and he had, the kids would get Alexander-ish type things during the day along with their lessons, and the kids in that school would come out just amazingly graceful and easily upright. But just to say one more word about that, because he really was focused on kids in his mind. I mean, obviously his bread and butter was adults with problems, but he makes a point in one of his books. He's in England at this point, and he says, when the average parent has a kid and they want to find a nanny for their kid, they'll go for the cheapest one, and they won't pay any attention to like how that person is using their body. It's not on their radar, and they don't take into account what could be a harmful influence in terms of just posture and movement patterns. Now today, everyone's super concerned about background checks. You don't want a serial killer in your house looking after your kids, right? They're very careful about that, but still today, I don't think most parents would think in terms of, wait a minute, how's this person using their body? Because that's what's going to have an imprint on the kid or kids they're looking after.
Yeah, that's such a fascinating perspective. So
He
they
was
should just be
very
tested.
attuned to that.
If you can't do a handstand, you can't be a babysitter. Sorry, that's it.
Well, it's not so much that. It's if you're constantly walking around over stiffening your shoulders, you're standing up straight like that, pulling your shoulders back, arching your back, the kid's going to look at that and he's going to go for it because that's out of the norm for him. He'll immediately start imitating that. So best to have someone that just, doesn't seem to have any overt issues around basic physical functioning and has fairly graceful posture and movement patterns.
I actually have a personal story about that. My nephew, he's about 1.5 years old. He's not even saying full sentences yet, and he imitates a lot of what you do. And so I was using resistance bands in the house. He came over to my parents and I was visiting, and I don't see him that often. And so I don't know if he's not observing anybody else using resistance bands. And so that in the couple times that he was seeing me, I would be using them. And as I'm exerting, I'm breathing heavy. I'm going. So then I come back. It was maybe the third time I had seen him. He comes back. I have the bands on the ground. He goes and he picks them up and he goes.
Yeah.
And he starts doing the breathing, and it was cute to see that, but it made me think, oh my goodness, he's watching what you're doing. I need to teach him how to exercise properly or how to run properly. And we did the same thing with running. I said, all right, let's go. We're gonna go for a run. And he would chase after me, and it's like whatever technique I was using, he was watching me. If I would be flailing my arms, he would flail his arms too. So yeah, you have to be careful with that.
Absolutely. But the good news is, I mean, no one has perfect, hardly anyone has perfect posture or perfect movement patterns, and you don't want to make life miserable for parents by warning them all the time about that. But the good news is, even if a kid has parents that have somewhat less than optimal movement patterns, that can be, they can learn to overcome that. I mean, that is what ultimately why a lot of people come for Alexander lessons, because those patterns have sort of, you could almost say, metastasized in their body minds, and are just there without them having any real idea that that is the case. I mean, a lot of people are quite shocked, for example, to see a side view of themselves for the first time, because mostly we see ourselves in the mirror, but we don't see side views very often. Maybe trying on clothes, that could be a mirror situation where you would. But a lot of people are very shocked to see what they look like from the side, and what they look like when they let go of what they think of is the best way to stand up straight. And they'll think, oh, for example, if their pattern is to lift their chest, pull their shoulders back, arch their lower back, which is some people's idea of a good way to stand up straight. And they look in the mirror, and you can point out, well, you've also pushed your pelvis forward and your whole back, and and you could help them change that. And they look, and they might feel like, oh my God, I'm about to fall on my face. If that's my old pattern, was that pulling back. But you show them with mirror or camcorder or something, you show them a sideways view, and they see that this person I'm looking at actually seems to be standing quite nicely up straight. He's not forward at all. So there's that kind of re-education that often is useful to help people, because they'll sometimes won't believe you when you tell them, hey, this is a much easier way to stand. They'll be so worried they're about to fall forward that they're not interested in hearing about it. So yeah.
How does somebody get? How does the Alexander technique begin? Is there a specific starting point?
Yes,
Every
there is.
person, or
There's
is it
a
dependent on the
specific.
assessment?
There's an origin story, and it's a little. It's deep in history now, and Alexander's been dead for 65 years, so we don't have a direct connection with it. But his backstory was he was from a very poor background. He grew up in Tasmania, which was like the worst possible place to be in Australia at that time. It was basically a penal colony. His grandparents were all convicts that had been shipped over from England. But he had a huge interest in Shakespeare and in reciting and acting, and he also was an amateur musician. He played the violin, and he got himself out of Tasmania onto the mainland of Australia, and he had a career as a teacher of acting, and he had roles. He was apparently very good at acting and reciting, but he would lose his voice. And he was forced to stop for periods of time. And he did all of the usual things you might do. He went to vocal coaches, he went to doctors, and nothing helped. And eventually he figured out that, well, he didn't have that problem when he was just talking normally to someone. It was when he was on stage that he suddenly had these issues. And he thought, I wonder if I'm doing something different when I'm on stage than when I'm just talking to someone at home. And it took him a while to figure it out. He used mirrors. He set up mirrors so he could get a side view of himself. He'd get a view from the back. He could see what was going on. And he was a very good observer. And he didn't take him too long to figure out that in his attempt to project his voice to the back of these auditoriums where there was no PA system at the time, it's the 1880s, 1890s, he was basically tightening his neck. And he was doing a little of this pushing forward, no doubt, to get his voice out there. And he discovered that if he learned how to stop doing that, his voice got out there even better with less effort. But it did take him a while to figure out how to let go of that pattern. He identified it fairly quickly, but it took a year or two, maybe 3, for him to figure out exactly how to make that change in a consistent way. And that's the origin story. And then he went on and he started teaching his stuff to other actors and other performers. And one of the doctors that he had gone to for help had been referring patients to him. And the doctor said, you really should go to London, because London, your work's too important to be stuck here in Australia. London was the center of the world for someone in the British Empire, and he did. And he became well known pretty quickly in theater circles and in all sorts of circles in England, and became semi-famous, I would say. So, and then later on, he started training teachers, and then there's a whole history of the development of the work. But it goes back to his experiments in probably the early 1890s, we're talking, late 1880s.
Yeah, after going to the doctor, they might have thought something was medically wrong because he
had all that checked out. Doctors couldn't find anything. The best they could do was to tell him to rest for a couple of weeks. Don't do any reciting. Don't do very little talking. And that just didn't work. I mean, it worked for about 10 minutes when he returned to the stage, but in no time, he was back in his old pattern, because the pattern itself had not been changed. You can rest, he could rest for years and then resumed his career, and the problem would have kicked in pretty quickly because the same stimuli were there. A big auditorium, lots of people, want to get my voice out to the back. That didn't change. It's possible, by the way, that if they had little clip-on mics and the like back then, he may never have, the Alexander technique might never have been invented or developed.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about.
It's very, very
work like that. A lot of inventions come out of something by accident, or just it was an unintended consequence. Now, I know exactly what you're saying with his whole story, because I've experienced that too with trying to film YouTube videos. When I first started to film, I felt so uncomfortable on camera. And I looked at myself visually when I'm playing the videos back early on, and I got my neck out like this, and my shoulders are forward. I couldn't believe it. And I would start to feel a strain in my neck. So then if somebody's experiencing musculoskeletal pain, like they have neck pain, or they have a pain between their shoulder blades, or even sciatica, some of these conditions, they do have a diagnosis, but they may be related to a pattern, like what you're saying. And
absolutely.
And everybody thinks, not everybody, but a lot of people do think that you need an exercise, or you need a bunch of exercises to get better. And oftentimes, in many cases, sometimes you don't even need an actual exercise. You actually just need to change your behavior and this pattern that's being repeated throughout the day.
Exactly. There are times when strengthening, stretching exercises could be useful for someone, but the exercise won't change the underlying pattern to any great extent. That's the problem. And, there's kind of almost like a fundamental division, different way of thinking in the Alexander world. I think for most people, if they have a problem, they feel what they have to do is do something to fix it. And the Alexander approach is, well, let's first see if you're doing something that's causing the problem. And if that's the case, then how can you learn how to stop doing that? That's our approach. Like that pushing forward of your head and neck that you described just now, that was you doing something that was creating an issue. And you could have all kinds of exercises, you could do all kinds of exercises, they wouldn't really change that. What has to change, you become aware, oh, I'm doing that with screens a lot, right? I'm wanting to get closer to the screen. And what exactly am I doing? Oh, I'm pushing my head and neck forward. I'm tightening my neck, probably tightening my upper torso. So a solution from an Alexander point of view is just stop doing that.
Yeah, it would be like trying to accelerate your vehicle. You have your right foot on the gas, and
Yeah.
you're wondering why it's not going anywhere. But then you
Mhm.
look down, and your left foot is pressing on the brake.
Or you have the parking brake on, and you're going somewhere, okay, but not you're creating a lot of extra wear and tear on the system, and it's not functioning very well. I mean, I think we've all had the experience of leaving a parking brake on, and oh, this doesn't feel right. I am going where I want to go, but it's not that great. And oh, get that get that out of the way, and everything's fine. It's a little like that. That's a very mechanistic type thing, and usually with us, it's more subtle than that. There are layers of things, but it's the same general idea. It's interfering with what would happen if you didn't interfere. And that's what I like to point to people like Fred Astaire or Muhammad Ali in his youth, not later on, but in his early days of boxing. I mean, what was it that made him so good? He wasn't the strongest boxer by any means, but he was incredibly fast and quick. And he could just sort of dance around his opponents and catch them off guard. I mean, he had incredible ability in that area. Or Fred Astaire, who even if you watch his old, I encourage my students to watch his movies with the sound off, so they're not caught up in the plot at all. And don't just concentrate on the dance scenes, but take a look at what does he do when he's just walking across the room or sitting down or standing up or talking to someone. Because it's everything he does is done with ease. And of course, the dance scenes are very dramatic, and he was obviously a skilled dancer, but he wouldn't have had that ease if there wasn't some overall really good coordination going on. He's an example of someone that he'd be hard pressed to say that an Alexander teacher could help him in any way. He really was there, so to speak.
Yeah, and going back real quick to Alexander's story,
yeah,
he went to the doctor first, and that's to rule out conditions. I mean, his story also would have been a lot different if he would have had a tumor in his throat and then pressing down on his vocal cords. And so, of course, that's why there's multiple professionals and healthcare professionals, and that's so important. But when I always say too, we need to work on correcting the underlying cause of the pain or the underlying cause of the problem. What you're describing is really what we're talking about. Yeah. It's really identifying, okay, even if it is a diagnosis, let's say your correct diagnosis is that you have a strained tendon, or it is that you have your, whether it's your disc or your bone pushing up against your nerve root, and it's causing sciatica.
Right.
You do have that, but why did that happen? Or what makes it worse during the day? Why do you feel it more at this point in the day compared to other times in the day. So that person might feel like they can't get better because they always feel the pain in a 24-hour cycle, but then there's fluctuations in the intensity and the location and other descriptions of the pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a
No,
lot.
Alexander did all the standard things. He went to vocal coaches. He went to several doctors. He was not, he didn't come into all this with an idea of coming up with some new method of teaching people. He just wanted to get back on stage. And he did ultimately, but by that time, people who knew him were observing him and saying, something's different about this guy. He's learned something new. I'd like to learn it too. And that basically is how we ended up being Alexander teachers. He was the first Alexander teacher, obviously. But, he set up a training course in the 30s in England, and then now there are training courses all around the world. And that people go through a fairly lengthy process. Usually it's 3 years, pretty much full time, to train to do this work.
And I'm sure he felt more confident on stage too. I'm sure that
yeah.
being able to relax his posture and keep his head back and his chin tucked a bit and opening up his vocal cords and get breathing better as well. I'm sure he felt better. He had better sense of well-being.
Well, he not only, he felt better, and he also had a lot more self-confidence, for sure. I mean, this guy, Alexander, went to England, 1904. He was probably about 25 years old at that point, 26 years old. He was a young man. He was from Australia, which in England at that time was not a desirable place to be from. I mean, Australia was looked down upon in the empire, and within Australia, Tasmania was looked down on. And he arrives. He does have a letter of introduction from his doctor in Melbourne, but he's basically on his own in London. And within a very short time, he's achieved some prominence. I think part of that was he was just a guy that if you ran into him, you'd say, he's got something. He's got something. And he projected a certain kind of confidence. And so, yeah.
Yeah, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. Yeah, absolutely.
So if somebody wants to learn more about the Alexander technique, where could they go to do that? And I know some of the listeners might also be interested in getting certified in the technique,
Right.
might want to become providers.
Mm-hmm.
Where could they learn more info about it?
My website, alexandertechnique.com, has several pages devoted to finding a teacher wherever you are in North America, England, rest of the world. So it's pretty easy to find a teacher. And then if you do start taking lessons, like in my case, I started taking lessons, and I realized fairly quickly that this was so much more useful than what I had been doing that I wanted to train to be a teacher. And back then there was no internet, you had to write letters to people and stuff. But I have a whole website devoted to how to find a teacher training course that's listed on that main site as well. And there are courses all around the world. In the US, there are probably, I'm guessing, around 10 or 12, maybe probably more. And a lot in England, and a lot in Europe, and in Australia, Israel. A lot of countries have quite a few training courses. So it's not hard to find one. There may not be one in your town. That's the problem if you're living in a smaller city, but there are plenty of training courses.
And somebody could find those training courses by going to your website.
Yeah, indirectly. I mean, I have a website that's just devoted to teacher training courses, but it's one of the ones listed on that main website as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate your time and your expertise, and I sure learned a lot about the technique because I didn't know a lot before. But it sounds like it makes a lot of sense, and I know it can help a lot of people.
Yeah, I would just say, just a final word for someone who's thinking about it, um, taking lessons. A course of lessons in the Alexander technique is not like a course of treatments in psychotherapy, for example, that might go on for years. Most people take lessons for a few months at the most, maybe one or two a week for a few weeks, and then one a week. I mean, it's not something you do indefinitely. And also, most people, after a very small number of lessons, typically two or three, will know that whether this is useful for them. It'll be pretty clear. Now, it's not always the case, but it's mostly the case that people will, after a short time, get some idea of where this is headed and have had some good experiences from it already.
That's good. Sometimes you don't know what you like or know what you need until you dip your toes in the water,
Absolutely.
see the
Yeah.
temperature. So,
Yeah.
good recommendations, and I appreciate your time. Stay safe out there.
Well, great. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I wish you well with the summit that this, I guess, is going to be a part of.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Good. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye bye.
Take care.